They reached the house of Gaius Petronius Celsus. It was imposing, befitting his status as a successful merchant who had made a fortune in the grain trade. The doorway was festooned with white wool and branches of greenery. 2 torches burned on either side, signaling to the city that this was a house where a wedding would be consummated tonight. The crowd grew louder as they approached, the songs more explicit, the shouts more urgent. Someone threw walnuts at her, another tradition, symbolizing fertility, the hard shells striking her shoulders and catching in the folds of her dress. Her husband stood in the doorway, waiting, but behind him she could see figures moving in the warm glow of the lamplight. Too many figures. This was not a private moment. This was not 2 people beginning a life together. There were witnesses waiting inside. There were rituals that required observation. There were things that would happen in front of others that she had believed, until her mother's tears that morning would happen only between husband and wife. Gaius Petronius Celsus smiled at her. It was not a cruel smile. He seemed genuinely pleased, perhaps even nervous himself. But his nervousness was that of a man hoping to perform well before an audience. Her nervousness was something else entirely. It was the terror of someone who has been told that something dreadful is about to happen, but not told exactly what. She had been prepared through hints, silences, and her mother's tear-streaked face for an ordeal whose specific nature remained hidden behind centuries of tradition that no one spoke about directly. They anointed the doorposts with oil and animal fat. She touched them as required, marking her arrival at her new home. Then Gaius lifted her over the threshold because tradition said it was bad luck for a bride to stumble, entering her husband's house for the first time, and because the gesture symbolized something older, something from a savage era when brides were captured and carried into their husbands' homes whether they wished to enter or not. The heavy door closed behind her. The singing of the crowd became muffled, and Flavia finally saw what was waiting in the atrium of her new home. There were 7 people present besides herself and her husband. An elderly woman in the robes of a pronuba, the matron of honor, is required to oversee the consummation of every proper Roman marriage. A priest of uncertain affiliation, whose presence would make no sense until later. 3 female slaves carrying cloths and basins of water and oil, their faces carefully blank in the way of servants, who have witnessed things they know they must never acknowledge. An older man, whom she would later learn was a physician, his bag of instruments resting at his feet. And standing beside a wooden structure that dominated the corner of the atrium, draped in a cloth that hid its exact shape, was a figure carved from dark wood. It stood nearly 4 feet tall, with features she could barely discern in the flickering lamplight, but which made her throat constrict when she glimpsed them. The pronuba stepped forward. She took Flavia's hands in her own. Her grip was firm, almost too firm, as if she expected Flavia to try to pull away. "Welcome to your husband's home." The torches flickered and sputtered in the night wind as the procession wound its way through the darkened streets of Rome. The year was 85 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. The month was June, the time the Romans considered most auspicious for a union of bloodlines. Flavia Tertia walked at the dead center of the procession. A saffron veil covered her face, obscuring her expression from the crowd. Her hair was arranged in 6 braids, bound with white wool in a style prescribed by traditions, stretching back centuries before her birth. She was 18 years old. In approximately 3 hours, she would finally understand why her mother had wept silently while helping her dress that morning. The wedding ceremony itself had been beautiful in its own way. The sacrifice of the pig had gone smoothly, its entrails revealing favorable omens to the priests. The contracts had been signed before witnesses, her father formally transferring her from his authority to her new husband's with the ancient words that made the transaction legal and binding. She had spoken the phrase that generations of Roman brides had spoken before her: Ubitu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. The words meant she was no longer herself. She belonged to him now, to Gaius Petronius Celsus, a man 23 years her senior, whom she had met exactly 4 times before today. But the ceremony in the daylight was only the public beginning. What waited at the end of this torchlit procession, in the house she had never entered, in the chamber that had been prepared according to rituals her mother refused to explain? That was where the true wedding would occur. That was where she would discover what it really meant to become a Roman wife. The crowd around her sang obscene songs as tradition demanded. The Fescennine verses were crude, loud, and explicit, describing in graphic detail what would happen to her tonight, what her husband would do to her, and what she would be required to accept. Young men in the crowd shouted, suggestions that made her face burn beneath the heavy veil. This too was tradition. The Romans believed that obscenity at weddings drove away the evil eye through the power of embarrassment and laughter. But Flavia was not laughing. She was counting her steps, marking the shrinking distance between herself and whatever waited in that house. She was trying to slow her breathing, trying to desperately hold on to her mother's final words from that morning. Do not resist. Whatever they require of you, do not resist. Resistance only makes it worse. The pronuba said, the rites must now be completed. Come, here is what they never taught you about Roman marriage. You have seen the movies where beautiful women in flowing robes recline on couches while servants bring them grapes and wine. You have read about Roman wedding ceremonies as quaint, ancient customs, charming traditions involving saffron veils, iron rings, and verses sung in the streets. You have been told that Rome was a civilization of law and order, of engineering and philosophy, of achievements that shaped the foundations of Western culture. But you have never been told what happened after the wedding procession reached its destination. You have never learned about the rituals that occurred behind closed doors while the crowd dispersed and the torches burned down. You have never discovered why ancient sources that describe Roman weddings in elaborate detail suddenly become vague and euphemistic when they reach the events of the wedding night itself. Why do phrases like the customary rites were performed and she was made a wife according to tradition appear in texts that otherwise spare no detail about Roman life? Tonight, you will learn what those phrases actually meant. You will discover why certain Roman writers declared that the wedding night customs were inherited from an era of barbarism that civilized Romans should have abandoned, but somehow never did. You will understand why the church fathers who converted Rome to Christianity described pagan wedding practices as abominations, requiring immediate abolition. You will learn about the figure that stood in the corner of the atrium, about what brides were required to do with it, about the witnesses who watched to ensure completion, and about the examinations that preceded and followed. You will learn about the entire systematic process by which Rome transformed women into wives, and you will understand why almost all of this was deliberately erased, why Christian Rome destroyed texts, smashed statues, and rewrote histories to eliminate evidence of what their ancestors had practiced for over 1,000 years. The rituals were not hidden because they were minor. They were hidden because they were central, and because acknowledging them required acknowledging things about Roman civilization that subsequent generations preferred to forget. If you find these hidden corners of history as disturbing and fascinating as I do, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Comment below telling me where you are listening from, and make certain you watch all the way to the end, because the final ritual I am going to describe, the one that occurred at dawn after everything else was completed, has only recently been reconstructed from fragments that survived the systematic destruction. When you hear what it involved, you will understand why the church worked so hard to ensure no one ever learned the truth. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Let me explain how Roman marriage actually worked, what it meant legally, socially, and religiously, and why the wedding night rituals were not aberrations, but logical consequences of how Romans understood women, property, and the transfer of both from one man to another. Roman marriage was not primarily about love. This seems obvious when stated directly, but its implications are profound. and extend into every aspect of how weddings were conducted. Marriage in Rome was a legal and economic transaction in which a woman was transferred from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. The Latin term was conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand, and it meant exactly what it sounds like. A bride became her husband's property in the most literal sense. Roman law could articulate. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal authority over his wife that he had over his slaves and his children, including, technically, the right of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia Tertia walked that torchlit procession, the law had softened somewhat. Women retained some property rights, and divorce was possible under certain circumstances. But the fundamental concept remained. Marriage was a transfer of ownership. And like all transfers of ownership, it required verification, ritual, and witness. Consider how the Romans handled other significant property transfers. When a farm was sold, witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected to verify it matched the seller's description. Rituals were performed to invoke the gods' blessing on the transfer and to ensure that no fraud was occurring. Boundaries were walked, documents were signed, and everyone involved understood exactly what was being exchanged. The Romans applied this same logic to marriage. The bride was property being transferred. Her value lay primarily in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs, children who would be indisputably the sons and daughters of her husband, and therefore entitled to inherit his property and continue his family line. This meant her physical capacity for reproduction required verification. Her status as a virgin, never before belonging to another man's line, required confirmation, and the actual transfer of her reproductive capacity from potential to active required witnessing, because a marriage not consummated was no marriage at all in Roman law. This is not interpretation or speculation. Roman legal texts are explicit about these requirements. A marriage was not complete until consummated. The consummation had to be verified by witnesses, because otherwise, how could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be confirmed, because otherwise, how could the husband be certain that any children she bore were his? Each of these requirements generated corresponding rituals that were practiced for over 1,000 years. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman logic and that horrify modern sensibilities, precisely because that logic is so alien to how we understand marriage today. Let me tell you about the pronuba, because she is central to understanding what happened in that atrium and in the bedchamber that followed. The pronuba was a married woman of good reputation, whose role was to oversee the transition of the bride from virgin to wife. Her presence was mandatory at respectable Roman weddings. She led the bride in certain rituals. She gave advice and instruction, and most importantly, she witnessed the consummation to verify that it had properly occurred. The sources are deliberately vague about exactly what this witnessing entailed. The physician and poet Soranus, writing in the 2nd century, refers to the pronuba's duty to observe the completion of marital duties. The agricultural writer Columella, in an unexpected digression in his treatise on farming, mentions that the pronuba must verify the transfer has been accomplished. Legal texts specify that disputed marriages could be resolved by the pronuba's testimony regarding what she observed on the wedding night. If the pronuba was merely present in the house while consummation occurred privately in a closed bedchamber, her testimony would be worthless in court. She would be reporting hearsay, saying only that she was told it happened. Roman courts did not accept hearsay testimony in property disputes, and marriage was a property transfer. For her testimony to carry legal weight, the pronuba had to witness directly, which means either the bedchamber was not closed, or the witnessing occurred in a space other than a private chamber. This is where the ancient sources become most frustratingly oblique, using euphemisms and implications rather than direct description. But archaeological evidence fills some of the gaps. Excavations of Roman houses have revealed rooms whose only apparent function was to accommodate observers while something occurred in a designated central space. Wall paintings in Pompeii depict wedding scenes that include multiple witnesses in positions and postures that make sense only if they were watching intimate activity occurring before them. Votive objects left at temples by new brides include thank offerings for surviving, their wedding nights, language. That seems excessive for a private, romantic encounter, but makes perfect sense if the night involved a public ordeal. Flavia Tertia was led through the atrium by the pronuba. She walked past the basin of water where she would later be washed, past the slaves who stood ready with cloths and oils, past the physician who would examine her before and after. She moved toward the draped figure standing in the corner. The pronuba guided her hands to the cloth that covered it. Now, the pronuba said, "You must greet Mutinous Titinus. You must ask his blessing. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia pulled back the cloth and saw what stood beneath. It was a wooden figure crudely carved, representing a form she had only seen in the graffiti that covered Roman walls. The form that appeared on amulets mothers, tied around their children's necks to ward off evil. The form that stood in gardens as a scarecrow might stand, threatening intruders with its aggressive posture. But this figure was not small like an amulet, nor functional like a scarecrow. This figure was sized precisely, deliberately, anatomically, for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the pronuba explained what Flavia must do. This is the moment where I need to explain something that modern histories of Rome either omit entirely or mention only in embarrassed footnotes. The Romans had a god named Mutinous Titanus, sometimes associated with the better-known garden deity Priapus. This god was represented as a phallus, and his worship was directly connected to marriage ritual. We know this because multiple ancient sources mention it, always briefly, always with visible discomfort, always rushing past to other topics. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was completing its conquest of Rome, described the practice with outrage. He wrote that Roman brides were required to sit upon the figure of Mutinous Titinus, that this was considered a sacred duty before consummation with the husband, and that the practice was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source writing to condemn paganism, but his description matches fragments from earlier, non-Christian texts that refer to the same practice with considerably less detail but similar basic facts. The church father Lactantius also references the custom, calling it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier and with no Christian axe to grind, mentions Mutinous Titinus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using language that implies physical contact without explicitly describing it. Arnobius, another Christian writer, provides perhaps the most detailed account, describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. What was the purpose of this ritual? The stated religious purpose was to seek the god's blessing for fertility, to invoke divine assistance for the bride's capacity to bear children. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was likely something else entirely. It was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstrating submission before witnesses, proving that the bride would do what she was required to do regardless of her own wishes. It was conditioning her to accept what would follow. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it, suggesting that the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language used by ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine's word is insidere, which means to sit upon or to settle onto. Arnobius uses language implying not just contact but penetration. Lactantius refuses to describe the details because they are too shameful, which would be an odd reaction to someone simply sitting on a statue's lap. Flavia stood before the figure of Mutinous Titanus. The pronuba guided her, positioned her, and instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician prepared to perform his examination afterward, and Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, and what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused. Theoretically, she had that choice, but refusal meant disgrace for her family, nullification of the contracts, and a return to her father's house as damaged goods that no respectable man would marry. It meant her mother's tears would have been for nothing. It meant everything she had been taught about duty, family, and a woman's role in society would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. She did not refuse. This is the point where I need to tell you about the examination, because it was not a single event, but rather a series of assessments that bracketed the wedding night rituals. Understanding the examination helps explain why witnesses were necessary, and what exactly they were witnessing. Before any wedding could proceed, a respectable Roman bride underwent examination by a midwife or physician to verify her virginal status. This was not optional for marriages involving significant property. The examination was documented, and the documentation became part of the legal record establishing the bride's value as a virgin being transferred for the first time. The techniques used were invasive by any standard, involving physical inspection that Roman medical texts describe in clinical detail, leaving no ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact, as never having belonged to another man, as carrying full value in the transaction. The groom's family had a legal right to this verification because they were paying a bride price and agreeing to certain financial obligations in exchange for a woman capable of producing unquestionably legitimate heirs. Then came the wedding itself, the procession, the rituals and the events of the wedding night. And after those events, another examination occurred. This post-consummation examination verified that the marriage had been completed, that the transfer of the bride from virgin to wife had been accomplished. The same physician or midwife who had examined her before now examined her again, documenting the change in her status. This created a system of verification that was legally robust. If disputes arose later, if the husband's family claimed the bride had not been a virgin, or if the bride's family claimed the marriage was never properly consummated, there were documented examinations and witness testimonies to resolve the question. The Romans valued legal precision. They were famously thorough in establishing evidence for every type of transaction. Marriage was no exception, but consider what this system required in practice. The bride was examined by a stranger before her wedding. She was required to perform ritual submission before witnesses. She was examined again afterward. Every step of her transition from father's property to husband's property was observed, verified, and documented. Her body was not her own. Her body was the property being transferred, and like all property transfers, it required inspection. The wedding night itself, the actual consummation with her husband, occurred within this framework of observation and verification. The pronuba was present throughout. Other witnesses might be present, depending on the social status of the families involved and the importance of verifying the marriage against future legal challenge. The understanding that the night's events would be discussed, documented, and potentially testified about in court shaped everything that happened. Now let me return to that atrium where Flavia Tertia stood after completing the ritual with the statue of Mutinous Titanus. The pronuba guided her to the basin of water where slaves waited to wash her. This washing had ritual significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god and preparing her for the encounter with her husband. But it was also practical preparation. The examination would follow, conducted by the physician who had been standing silent throughout, observing, waiting for his role in the proceedings. Flavia was led to a couch positioned in the center of the atrium. This was not the bedchamber. This was the public room of the house, the space where business was conducted, where clients were received, where the household shrine stood with its images of ancestral spirits watching over everything that occurred. She was positioned on the couch by the pronuba, the physician approached. The examination was thorough in ways that Roman medical texts describe with clinical precision. The physician confirmed that the ritual with the statue had been properly completed. He verified that her status was consistent with what the pre-wedding examination had established. He pronounced her prepared for the consummation to follow. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required. If any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged, what strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions of these practices is not just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans do not seem to have viewed these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before a sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. The procedures existed to protect the interests of the families involved, not to consider the experience of the woman at the center. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber that had been prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned for an optimal view from the doorway, which would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided light sufficient for the pronuba to observe from her position near the door. The slaves who would be needed afterward stood ready in the corridor. Her husband entered. He had changed from his wedding garments into simpler clothing. He seemed nervous, which surprised her. She had assumed he would be experienced, confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment. Before approaching the bed, the pronuba spoke. Her voice was formal, ritualistic, reciting words that had been spoken at thousands of wedding nights before. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion of the transfer. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when she deemed it necessary, ensuring that the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements for verification. The door remained open. Sounds carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a ritual of verification that had been designed over centuries to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dawn, the physician returned for the final examination. This examination confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided her testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would bear 3 children over the next decade. She would manage her husband's household competently. She would attend festivals and ceremonies and fulfill all the duties expected of a matron of her status, and she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughter when her daughter's marriage was arranged. Because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things were done. It was what being a Roman wife required. The women who came before her had endured it. The women who came after would endure it as well. This was simply what marriage meant. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed or participated in. The rituals were so embedded in the fabric of Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes or walks. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter in whispers and warnings, in tears shed while arranging bridal hair, in euphemisms and implications rather than explicit instruction. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence was not a conspiracy. It was simply how deeply embedded these practices were in Roman culture. They were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them seemed as pointless as describing water to a fish. But the practices varied across time and social class in ways worth understanding. What I have described so far represents customs among the Roman middle and upper classes during the early imperial period, families wealthy enough to care about property transfer, but not so exalted that they could ignore tradition. Different rules applied at the extremes of Roman society. Among the poorest Romans, elaborate verification rituals were unnecessary because there was little property to transfer and little reason for legal disputes. Marriages among slaves and freedmen were informal. Arrangements without the ritual apparatus that surrounded property unions. The detailed examination and witness requirements applied primarily to marriages involving significant legal and financial stakes. At the other extreme, among the senatorial aristocracy and the imperial family itself, the rituals could be even more elaborate. When a daughter of a prominent family married, the political implications required absolute certainty about the marriage's validity. More witnesses might be present. More thorough documentation might be prepared. The pronuba might be a woman of particular social standing whose testimony would carry exceptional weight if ever required. The wedding night became a semi-public event because the semi-public nature protected against future challenge. The imperial family presented special complications. When an emperor's daughter married, the marriage had dynastic implications that affected succession and political stability. The verification requirements for such marriages were accordingly extreme. We have fragmentary evidence suggesting that imperial wedding nights were witnessed by multiple officials whose formal reports were preserved in state archives. The bride was not just becoming a wife, but potentially becoming a mother of future emperors. Nothing about her transition from virgin to wife could be left to private assurance. The Emperor Augustus, who ruled Rome at the birth of the imperial system, was famously concerned with moral reform and the restoration of traditional values. His legislation regarding marriage included provisions strengthening the verification requirements, making it harder to dispute a properly witnessed marriage, and increasing penalties for adultery that might confuse paternity. These laws were presented as moral reform, a return to the virtuous practices of ancient Rome. In practice, they formalized and strengthened the system of control and verification that treated women's bodies as property requiring careful documentation. By the time Christianity began transforming Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, these practices had been standard for half a millennium or more. Generations of Roman women had experienced their wedding nights as Flavia. Tertia experienced hers, observed, examined, and documented. The rituals seemed eternal, unchangeable, the way marriage had always been and would always be conducted. Then the Christians arrived and declared it an abomination. The Christian transformation of Roman marriage deserves examination, because it explains both why the pagan rituals ended and why evidence about them was so thoroughly destroyed. Christianity brought a fundamentally different understanding of marriage, sexuality, and women's spiritual status. These new understandings made the traditional Roman practices not just unnecessary, but intolerable. First, Christianity declared that women had souls equal to men. This seems obvious today, but it was revolutionary in the Roman context. If women were fully human, spiritually complete, made in God's image equally with men, then treating them as property to be examined and verified was no longer acceptable. The entire logic of the verification rituals collapsed. Once you accepted that the bride was a person rather than a possession. Second, Christianity declared marriage a sacrament, a holy mystery reflecting the union of Christ and the Church. A sacrament could not include elements that the Church considered obscene or degrading. The ritual with the statue of Mutinus Titinus, the examinations, the witnessed consummation, all of these were incompatible with marriage as a sacred mystery. They had to be eliminated to make room for Christian ritual. Third, Christianity emphasized privacy and modesty regarding intimate matters in ways foreign to Roman tradition. The public and semi-public nature of Roman wedding night rituals was exactly what Christian teaching considered most problematic about pagan sexuality. The Christians wanted consummation to be private, unseen, between husband and wife and God only. The entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive to Christian sensibility. The transition took several centuries and was never entirely complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that elements of the traditional rituals persisted in some areas long after Christianity became the official religion. Rural communities, in particular, seem to have maintained older practices under a thin Christian veneer. But in the cities, among the educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed. The suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of mutinous Titanus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay without being copied. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed or plastered over. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial, her observation function eliminated. Within a few generations, the detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone except scholars who studied the fragmentary surviving sources. The fragments that survive give us glimpses into what was lost. A reference in one text to procedures too shameful to describe, a mention in another of customs inherited from barbaric ancestors, archaeological findings that only make sense if certain practices occurred. These fragments allow reconstruction, but the reconstruction will always be incomplete. Too much was deliberately destroyed. The Christians did their work thoroughly, and what they could not destroy, they buried in euphemism and silence. What survived most clearly was the memory of the statues. Mutinous Titanus appears in enough sources that his existence and his role in wedding ritual cannot be denied, only minimized. Modern scholars who address him tend to suggest that the ritual was symbolic, brief, minimally intrusive. But the language of the ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustine did not rage against symbolic gestures. Lactantius did not consider brief ceremonies too shameful to name. Whatever happened with those statues was significant enough to outrage Christians who had seen every other form of pagan practice and had developed thick skins for heathen custom. Flavia Tertia died in the year 127 AD at approximately age 60. She had been a wife for over 40 years. She had raised children, managed a household, and participated in the religious and social life expected of a Roman matron. She had witnessed her own daughter's wedding and presumably prepared her daughter for what that wedding would involve, passing along the knowledge her own mother had passed to her. What did she think about her own wedding night in the decades that followed it? Did she remember it with trauma, with acceptance, or with something in between? Did she consider it an ordeal survived, or simply a duty completed? Did she wish for her daughter something different, or did she accept that this was how things were and would always be? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies and their own lives were not considered relevant to the histories, legal texts, and medical manuals that men produced. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It was erased because it revealed something uncomfortable about the civilization we have inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law, government, and culture. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance. It suggests that civilization can be simultaneously advanced and brutal, that legal sophistication can coexist with systematic dehumanization, and that practices we would consider abusive can be so normalized that they seem unremarkable to those participating in them. The wedding night rituals of Rome are gone. The statues are smashed. The texts are burned. The customs are forgotten. But the women who experienced them were real. Their bodies were real. What was done to them was real. And we owe it to them to acknowledge it, to speak what their world made unspeakable, to remember what their successors tried so hard to make forgotten. For Flavia Tertia, who walked that torchlit procession without knowing what waited at its end. For her mother, who wept while braiding her hair. For her daughter, whom she prepared for the same ordeal. For all the generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of verification and control rather than private unions. They lived, they endured, they were silenced. But we remember, if this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I have prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you will not want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. I will see you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about civilization, power, and the systematic control of women across the ages.